Welcome. Most people fear the dark. They fear the things they might see in the shadows, the creatures that might lurk just beyond the firelight. But there's another kind of fear, one that is far more subtle and far more profound. It is a fear of what you might hear when there's supposed to be nothing. It is a fear of perfect, absolute silence. Tonight's story is about a man who did not fear silence. He chased it. His name was Mark, and he was a soundscape artist, a man who dedicated his life to the obsessive pursuit of pure, untainted sound. For him, silence wasn't emptiness. It was a canvas, and the faint, natural sounds of the world were the paint. He traveled to the most remote corners of the globe, searching for places untouched by the noise of humanity, just to listen. This story is about his final expedition, a solo camping trip to a high-altitude lake in the Rockies, a place fabled for its profound quiet. He went there seeking the perfect canvas. He had no idea that the canvas was already occupied, that something was living inside the silence he so desperately craved. What follows is a story of what Mark found when he listened too closely to nothing at all. For Mark, the world was a symphony of noise, and most of it was an unbearable cacophony. The rumble of traffic, the drone of an air conditioner, the incessant chatter of a crowded street, it was all a form of pollution to him, a muddying of the pristine audio world he knew existed just beyond the reach of civilization. His obsession began in childhood, when he first put on a pair of noise-canceling headphones and heard, for the first time, the sound of his own heartbeat. From that moment on, he was a collector, not of things, but of pure sounds. He built a career out of it, selling his high-fidelity recordings of nature to filmmakers and meditation apps. But it was never about the money. It was about the hunt for a place so quiet he could record the sound of an icicle melting or a spider spinning its web. This trip, he believed, would be his masterpiece. A remote lake, miles from any flight path, surrounded by ancient mountains that acted as a natural sound barrier. It was, in his mind, one of the last truly silent places on Earth. He couldn't have known that the silence wasn't empty. It was just waiting. The story of what happened on that mountain is a testament to a terrible truth. The most frightening thing in the world is not a loud monster. It is a quiet one. And this is the story of the last recording Mark ever made. A recording of a sound he wished, with all his soul, he could unhear. Mark arrived at the trailhead just after noon, his old Jeep kicking up a cloud of dust as he pulled into the empty gravel lot. The world he was leaving behind was one of constant, low-grade noise, the hum of servers, the drone of traffic, the endless chatter of humanity. The world he was entering was one of profound, almost sacred quiet. The 2-hour hike to the lake was not a trial, but a transition. With every step deeper into the wilderness, the sounds of civilization fell away, replaced by the gentle percussion of his own boots on the trail and the whisper of the wind through the high pines. The location was a place he had spent months researching. A high-altitude alpine lake, a perfect bowl of granite and ancient forest that acted as a natural amphitheater, shielded from the wind and the noise of the world below. It was, according to his research, one of the most acoustically pure environments left in North America. For Mark, it was a cathedral of silence. He reached the lake's edge as the afternoon sun began to dip, casting a golden, liquid light across the water's surface. The air was thin, cool, and utterly still. There was no bird song, no animal chatter. It was the acoustic twilight, that brief, holy moment between the sounds of the day and the sounds of the night. Mark stood there, his eyes closed, just listening. He heard the gentle lapping of water against the shore, the distant sigh of wind over a far ridge, and the steady, quiet rhythm of his own heartbeat. It was perfect. He set up his camp with the meticulous, practiced precision of a surgeon. The small, one-man tent was placed to face the lake, his supplies were stored neatly, and then came the most important part. He unpacked his primary recording rig, a state-of-the-art digital recorder with a pair of ultra-sensitive condenser microphones, all mounted on a small tripod. He didn't place it in the tent with him. He placed it outside, about 10 feet from the tent flap, aimed directly at the heart of the forest. He wanted to capture the sound of the woods, not the sound of himself breathing in his sleep. As he made his final adjustments, he took note of a large, ancient tree that stood sentinel near his campsite. It was a gnarled old pine, its branches twisted into strange, reaching shapes, its bark scarred and dark. He noted it simply as a landmark, a point of interest, unaware of its local legends or the role it would play in the coming nightmare. He armed the recorder, setting it to voice activation mode to conserve battery, a decision that would later become a source of both mystery and terror. As darkness fell and the first stars began to appear in the clear mountain sky, Mark felt a sense of profound peace. He was alone, isolated, and about to capture the purest sounds of the night. He had no idea that the silence he revered was not empty. It was merely listening. The night passed in a deep and dreamless sleep, the kind of profound rest that only comes from true, absolute quiet. Mark awoke not to an alarm, but to the gentle, gradual brightening of the world outside his tent. The first light of dawn was filtering through the thin nylon, painting the interior in soft, gray hues. He lay still for a long moment, simply listening. There was no dawn chorus yet, only the profound, pre-dawn silence, a canvas of pure, untouched sound that felt ancient and holy. For Mark, this was the ultimate reward, the very thing he had journeyed all this way to experience. He felt a surge of pure, unadulterated excitement, the same thrill a treasure hunter feels upon finding a map to a lost city. The true treasure, he knew, was stored on a small memory card in the digital recorder just outside his tent. Last night's symphony, the secret sounds of the wilderness when it believed itself to be completely alone, was waiting for him. He imagined the sounds he might have captured, the faint, ghostly call of a nocturnal owl on its final hunt, the rustle of a deer stepping silently through the undergrowth, perhaps even the distant howl of a lone wolf echoing off the granite peaks. He unzipped his tent, the sound a jarring intrusion on the morning stillness, and was greeted by a world of breathtaking beauty. A low, silver mist hung over the surface of the lake, its water a perfect dark mirror of the snow-dusted peaks on the far side. The air was so cold and crisp it felt like a physical thing in his lungs. He moved with a quiet reverence, his every action deliberate so as not to disturb the pristine soundscape. After a quick, simple breakfast of a protein bar and cold water from his canteen, the moment he had been waiting for arrived. He retrieved the recording equipment from its tripod. There was no sign of disturbance. The sensitive microphones were exactly as he had left them. Two small, metallic ears pointed at the heart of the woods. He brought the recorder back into his tent, a small, portable studio where he could control the listening environment. With a sense of ceremony, he pulled out his most prized possession, a pair of studio-grade noise-isolating headphones. They were his window into the secret world of sound. He settled onto his sleeping bag, the headphones feeling heavy and substantial in his hands. This was the moment of discovery, the culmination of all his planning and travel. He was about to listen to the voice of a place that had not been heard by human ears in generations. He plugged the headphones into the recorder, took a deep, cleansing breath, and as the rising sun began to burn the mist off the lake, he pressed play. He closed his eyes, ready to be immersed in the symphony of the night, completely unaware that he was about to hear the first impossible note of a symphony composed in hell. Mark settled back, the headphones creating a perfect seal around his ears, plunging him into an isolated world of pure sound. The recording began. The initial sounds were exactly what he expected. The gentle, almost imperceptible hiss of the high-gain preamps, followed by the first tentative notes of the nocturnal world. For the first hour, It was a masterpiece of natural acoustics. He heard the faint, ghostly call of a distant owl, a sound so clear he could almost feel the texture of its feathers. He heard the delicate, rhythmic chirping of crickets, a sound that rose and fell in a gentle, hypnotic wave. At one point, he even captured the sound of a pine cone detaching from a high branch and tumbling down, its journey marked by a series of soft, woody clicks before a final, satisfying thud on the forest floor. This was what he lived for. This was the symphony he had come to record. He was lost in it, a smile of pure contentment on his face. It was about an hour into the recording that he first noticed the anomaly. It wasn't a sound, it was the lack of one. The recording, which had been a continuous stream of subtle, natural noise, suddenly cut out. There was a moment of perfect digital silence, and then it started again, picking up in the middle of a cricket's chirp. He paused the playback, frowning. He knew exactly what it was. It was a function of his recorder. The voice activation setting, or Vox, was designed to save memory and battery by automatically pausing the recording when the ambient sound dropped below a certain threshold. When a new sound occurred, it would start recording again. He had set the sensitivity to its absolute maximum, so sensitive that it should have been triggered by the sound of a falling leaf. For the recording to have stopped, the world outside his tent must have become, for a moment, completely and utterly silent. Not just quiet, silent. It was a level of silence that, in the living, breathing forest, should have been impossible. He scrolled through the audiophile's timeline. He saw them then, gaps, dozens of them scattered throughout the night's recording. Some lasted only a few seconds, others stretched for nearly a minute. There were blank, dead spaces in his symphony, moments where the entire world outside his tent had seemingly held its breath. This was the first omen. It wasn't a terrifying sound, but a quiet, creeping glitch in the laws of nature. Mark, however, was a man of logic. He immediately began to formulate rational explanations. Perhaps a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure had momentarily deadened all sound. Perhaps the recorder's highly sensitive threshold had been fooled by a perfect equilibrium of competing frequencies. He saw it as a fascinating but ultimately explainable data anomaly, a puzzle to be solved. He made a mental note to analyze the gaps later. He had no way of knowing that he wasn't listening to an absence of sound. He was listening to the creature's footsteps. Mark spent the rest of the afternoon feeling deeply unsettled by the unnatural gaps in his recording. It was a detail that didn't fit, a loose thread in the otherwise perfect tapestry of the soundscape. He tried to occupy himself, making notes, preparing his evening meal, but his mind kept returning to those moments of absolute, impossible silence. He knew he had to analyze the recording more closely. As evening fell, he once again retreated into the isolation of his tent, the headphones serving as his only connection to the events of the previous night. He decided to ignore the larger gaps for now and instead focus on the transitions, the moments just before and just after the silences. He scrolled to a section in the middle of the night where a long period of cricket chirps was interrupted by a 10-second gap before the chirping resumed. He played the section at normal speed. It sounded fine. Then he slowed it down, isolating the fraction of a second just before the recording cut out. He listened again. Nothing. He amplified the gain, pushing the levels far higher than he normally would, introducing a wash of digital noise, but also magnifying any subtle sounds he might have missed. He played it one more time, and then he heard it. It was a faint, sharp sound, almost too quick to register. A single, dry click. It wasn't the sound of an insect, which would have been a more organic, chittering noise. It wasn't the sound of a twig snapping, which would have had a woody resonance. This was a clean, almost mechanical sound, like a pebble tapping lightly against glass or a tongue clicking against the roof of a mouth. It was a sound that had no business being in the middle of a silent forest. He searched the rest of the recording and found 3 more instances of it, each one occurring a split second before the recorder was triggered into silence. It was a pattern. The omen was no longer just the silence itself, but the strange, unnatural sound that seemed to precede it. Mark felt a shiver of unease that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. His scientific mind immediately began formulating explanations. It was an anomaly in the recorder's hardware, a physical sound made by the device itself as it powered down its microphone. It was a static discharge. It was a logical, explainable, technical problem. He dismissed it, just as he had dismissed the gaps in the recording, because the alternative that something was out there in the dark, something that made a quiet, deliberate click just before the entire world went silent, was too terrifying to even consider. The second night left a deeper scar than the first. The unsettling, quiet, and the strange clicks were no longer just data anomalies. They felt like a prelude, a quiet tuning of an orchestra before a terrifying performance. Mark found himself unable to relax. The serene cathedral of silence he had so eagerly entered now felt like a vast, empty room where he was not alone. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. Every shadow seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at it. He needed a distraction, something to anchor his rational mind and push back against the tide of primal fear. As evening approached, he decided to stay inside the tent, the thin nylon walls providing a fragile illusion of security. He powered on his laptop, not to analyze more audio, but to read. Before the trip, in his obsessive quest for information about the quietest places on Earth, he had downloaded a handful of articles and blog posts about remote locations. One of them had caught his eye, an old, obscure article from a travel blog titled "The Last Silent Places." This article, he now realized, would serve as his only guide. He opened the file. The article was written in a lyrical, almost reverent tone, describing several remote locations with a poet's sensibility. He scrolled down to the section about the very lake where he was now camped. The author wrote of the profound, deafening silence, the feeling of being at the top of the world, and the almost spiritual sense of peace the place offered. It was all familiar, mirroring Mark's own initial feelings. But then, tucked away at the end of the section, was a single paragraph that made him stop. It was a brief, almost dismissive mention of local folklore. The author had clearly included it for a bit of local color, a quaint and charming piece of mountain superstition. The old-timers in the nearest town, the article read, speak of a specific tree near the lake's northern shore. They call it the listening tree. It is an ancient, gnarled pine, far older than the rest of the forest. And legend says it has a peculiar quality. If a person sits beneath its branches, completely still and completely silent, for a full hour after the sun has set, they will begin to hear the whispers of the forest itself. Not the wind, the legend insists, but the memories of the woods, the voices of all the things that have lived and died there. Mark read the paragraph twice. His eyes drifted towards the tent flap. Through the mesh screen, he could see the silhouette of the strange, twisted pine tree near his campsite, its dark branches reaching up towards the twilight sky like skeletal fingers. It was the same tree. He let out a short, humorless laugh, a sound that was quickly swallowed by the oppressive quiet. A scientist by trade and a skeptic by nature, he saw the legend as nothing more than a fanciful story, a charming piece of folklore born from the isolation and the strange acoustics of the mountains. He imagined old loggers, their minds playing tricks on them after too many lonely nights. It was a romantic, foolish notion. He closed the laptop, feeling a strange sense of comfort. The world was still a logical place, full of superstitious stories designed to explain away the natural and the unknown. He had his science. He had his data. He had no idea that the folklore he was so quick to dismiss was a far more accurate field guide to this place than any of his scientific equipment. Mark read the paragraph again, a skeptical smile touching his lips. The listening tree. The name was folkloric, unscientific. He pictured the locals, loggers, and hunters from generations past, perhaps sitting around a campfire, spinning spooky tales to explain the deep, unsettling quiet of this particular mountain. It was a very human response. When faced with an unexplainable phenomenon, people create gods, spirits, and legends. The narrator, in that moment, felt a surge of scientific hubris. He had equipment, he had data. He could measure the silence, analyze it, break it down into frequencies and amplitudes. He had no need for superstition. He took a sip of his now cold coffee, his eyes glancing out of the tent. Through the mesh screen, he could see the tree, its skeletal form stark against the twilight sky. It was just a tree, he told himself. An old pine, probably a survivor of a forest fire or a lightning strike long ago, which would account for its strange, twisted shape. He reread the last part of the legend. You can hear the whispers of the forest, not the wind, but the memories of the woods, the voices of all the things that have lived and died there. An idea sparked in Mark's analytical mind. Could there be a scientific explanation for the myth? Perhaps the tree and the surrounding geology had a unique acoustic property. Maybe the shape of the rocks and the density of the wood created a strange resonance effect, amplifying low-frequency sounds from miles away, making them sound like whispers. It was a fascinating hypothesis, something he could test. For a moment, he considered taking his equipment out and performing the very experiment the legend described, sitting in silence beneath the tree for an hour. But then, a wave of exhaustion and the lingering unease from the previous night held him back. Besides, it felt foolish. He was a scientist, not a ghost hunter. He closed the laptop, feeling a false sense of restored confidence. The legend of the listening tree had given him a rational framework for his own disquiet. The place was known to be strange. While he was hearing the gaps, the clicks must simply be natural acoustic phenomena that the locals had mythologized into whispers. He had a logical explanation, a neat box to put all the unsettling events into. He was entirely unaware that the guide in the article was not a piece of entertainment, but a terrifyingly accurate warning. He had found the map, but he was laughing at it, never knowing it was, pointing directly to the monster's lair. Mark's third day at the lake was a day lost to obsession. The comfort he had felt in the local legend of the listening tree had evaporated with the morning mist, leaving behind a residue of cold, nagging doubt. His scientific mind could not let go of the anomalies in his recording, the perfect, unnatural silences, the sharp, inorganic clicks. These were not the stuff of folklore. These were data points, and they were wrong. He knew he couldn't rest until he had a logical, verifiable explanation. He spent the entire day inside his tent. The beautiful, sunlit world outside might as well have not existed. For him, the only world that mattered was the one contained within the waveforms on his laptop screen. This was the beginning of his true investigation, a descent into an acoustic rabbit hole from which he might never emerge. He was no longer a passive listener, appreciating the symphony of the night. He was now a hunter, stalking a single discordant note. His focus was on the gaps. He imported the audio from the first night into his professional analysis software, the screen now filled with the green, jagged lines of the soundscape. He could see the recording as a whole, the dense clusters of sound from the crickets, the sharp peaks of the owl's call, and then the flat, dead lines of the silent periods. He zoomed in on one of the transitions, the exact moment the world went quiet. He played it back again and again. Nothing. He then began a painstaking process, a digital excavation. He isolated the final fraction of a second of sound before a gap and amplified it, boosting the gain until the gentle hiss of the background noise became a roaring waterfall. He was pushing his equipment to its absolute limit, searching for a ghost in the machine. He put on his headphones, closed his eyes, and listened. Through the roaring static, he could hear the last, fading chirp of a cricket. And then, just as the sound was about to be consumed by the silence, he heard something else. It was a faint, almost subliminal sound, a texture more than a note. It was a dry, rustling, sibilant sound, like the crushing of dead leaves, or a long, slow exhalation of breath through dry lips. His eyes snapped open. He played it again, and again. It was there. It was real. It was a sound that was organic, yet utterly alien to the known sounds of the forest. It was a sound that had no right to be there. He quickly found the same rustling texture at the edge of every single silent gap in the recording. It was the bookend to every moment of impossible quiet. His scientific mind frantically tried to categorize it. Was it the sound of a snake slithering over the microphone? The wind catching a loose piece of fabric on the tent? But it was too consistent, too deliberate. He sat back, a cold sweat beading on his forehead. He had found his anomaly. He had found a pattern in the silence. He had no idea in that moment that what he was listening to was not a sound. It was a voice, clearing his throat. He sat there for what felt like an hour, playing that single half-second snippet of sound over and over again. The dry, rustling texture filled his headphones, a sound so alien it seemed to defy classification. His scientific mind cycled through a Rolodex of possibilities, the friction of a pine needle against the microphone's wind guard, the chitinous legs of a strange insect, the sound of ice crystals forming in the cold night air. Each hypothesis was more desperate, more unlikely than the last. The sound was too deliberate, too structured. It was his ears, his most trusted and finely tuned instruments, that finally betrayed his rational mind. After the 20th repetition, his brain began to assemble the rustling, sibilant noise into a shape. It wasn't just a sound, it was a phoneme, the basic building block of a word, a long, drawn-out S sound, followed by something guttural, a sound formed deep in the throat that had not seen moisture in a very long time. He felt a wave of nausea. He ripped the headphones off, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and stared at the silent, unassuming recorder on the table. It was a voice. His entire being, every ounce of his training and experience, screamed that what he had just heard was a whisper. But his logical mind refused to surrender. A voice? Here? In a place certified as one of the most acoustically isolated spots on the continent? It was impossible. He had seen no one, heard no one. There were no other campers for 50 miles. The sound had to be an illusion, a form of auditory pareidolia. His brain creating a familiar pattern out of random noise, just as people see faces in the clouds. He clung to this explanation, this last piece of scientific driftwood in the sea of encroaching madness. But he couldn't stop himself. His hand, as if with a will of his own, reached out and put the headphones back on. He had to listen again. He had to be sure. He amplified the next section, the moments just before another long, unnatural silence. He held his breath and listened. And there it was again, the same dry, rustling sound. But this time, it was different. It was clearer, it was longer, and this time, he could make out the word. It was a single, drawn-out word, a sound that was both a question and a statement, a sound of pure Asian desolation. It was the sound of something impossibly old, trying to remember how to speak. It was the sound of his own name, the discovery of a potential voice, a single, horrifying word that sounded like his own name, shattered the last remnants of Mark's scientific composure. He spent his third day in a state of agitated paralysis. He couldn't bring himself to listen to the recording again. Yet he couldn't bring himself to do anything else. He paced the small clearing, his boots tracing a frantic, circular path in the dirt around his tent. He would stare at the gnarled, silent, listening tree, then at the placid, dark water of the lake, seeing not a beautiful landscape, but a gallery of silent suspects. He was a man trapped in a paradox. His entire life was dedicated to the pursuit of pure, objective sound. Yet he was now faced with a recording that his logic told him was impossible, a sound that his gut told him was an omen. He was terrified. But his terror was secondary to a more powerful, more dangerous emotion: his obsessive need to know. The scientist in him had to have proof. He had to replicate the results. As night fell for the third time, Mark's actions were no longer those of a soundscape artist, but of a ghost hunter laying a trap. He checked his equipment with a feverish intensity, replacing the batteries, formatting the memory card, and recalibrating the microphones. He once again placed the recorder on his tripod outside the tent, in the exact same spot as the previous night. But this time, it felt different. He was no longer just recording the sounds of the night, he was conducting an experiment, and he himself was the bait. He retreated into his tent but did not sleep. He couldn't. He sat in the darkness, his sleeping bag pulled around him, and he listened. He listened to the forest, which remained unnervingly quiet. He listened to the hiss of the recorder's preamps, which he could just barely hear through the nylon walls of the tent. He was a man holding a vigil, waiting for a ghost to speak. The night passed in an agony of silence. No whispers, no clicks, no unnatural gaps in the ambient sound. By the time the first gray light of dawn appeared, Mark was limp with a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. Nothing had happened. The logical part of his brain seized on this, a lifeline in a sea of fear. It had been an anomaly, a fluke, auditory pareidolia. With a heavy sigh, he unzipped the tent. The morning was cold and still. He brought the recorder inside. As he prepared to listen, a part of him hoped to find nothing but the gentle, natural sounds of the forest. But a deeper, more obsessive part of him prayed that the anomaly would be there again, proving he wasn't going mad. He plugged in his headphones, took a shaky breath, and began to listen to the second night's recording. The first few hours were exactly as they should be. A clean, beautiful recording of the high-altitude night. Crickets, the wind, the distant call of a lone coyote. He scrolled forward, his eyes on the timestamp display of the recorder. 1 a.m., 2 a.m. Still nothing but pure, natural sound. His relief was palpable. It had all been in his head. Then he reached the timestamp, 3:17 a.m. The recording, which had been silent for several minutes, suddenly activated. There was no preceding click, no rustle of leaves, just a sudden, sharp burst of sound. Mark's entire body went rigid. The sound that burst from the recorder was not the organic sound of the forest. It was a voice, the same dry, rustling, sibilant voice he had discovered hidden in the static the night before. But this time, it wasn't a fragmented whisper at the edge of hearing. It was loud, it was clear, and it was undeniably, horrifyingly speaking his name. Mark. The sound was a long, drawn-out exhalation, a sound like autumn leaves skittering across cold pavement. It was a voice that hadn't been used in centuries, and it was using his name for practice. He ripped the headphones from his head as if they were on fire, a strangled cry escaping his lips. He stared at the recorder, this small, black box of electronics that had just become a conduit for the impossible. His scientific mind, his last bastion of sanity, was in full retreat, but it fought one last, desperate battle. It was a fluke, a radio signal interference, a voice from a distant hiker's walkie-talkie that had somehow, impossibly, bled into his recording. It had to be. With a trembling hand, he put the headphones back on. He had to analyze it. He had to debunk it. His professional life was built on data, and he would use that data to prove his own sanity. His recorder was a stereo device with two distinct microphone channels, left and right. Any sound recorded from the forest will be slightly louder in one channel than the other, giving it a sense of direction and space. A sound from the left will be in the left ear. A sound from the right would be in the right ear. He opened the audio file in his analysis software and looked at the waveform for that single, terrible word. His blood ran cold. The sound was perfectly, equally balanced between the left and right channels. In the three-dimensional world of sound, this meant one thing and one thing only: The source of the sound had been located at the exact central point between the two microphones. He pulled up the photos he had taken of his campsite setup. The image on his screen showed the recorder on its tripod 10 feet outside the tent. The two microphones were pointed like twin cannons into the dark maw of the forest. He drew an imaginary line on the photo, an X marking the spot exactly between the two microphones. And then he felt a wave of vertigo so profound he nearly fell out of his chair. The center point, the origin of the sound, was not in the forest. It was not 50 yards away or 100 yards away. It was a precise, measurable location. It was the exact spot, down to the inch, where his head had been resting as he slept inside the tent. The sound wasn't an intruder from the outside world, calling to him from the dark woods. It had been in the tent with him. It had been inches from his ear, in the one place he had considered a sanctuary. The voice hadn't been recorded from the forest. It had whispered his name into the microphones from the inside, from the place he had been sleeping. The silence hadn't just been waiting outside, it had been lying next to him all night. The revelation that the sound had originated from inside his tent had shattered Mark's world. He spent his third day in a state of feverish, paranoid activity. The beautiful, serene landscape around him was now just a crime scene, and he was the sole, terrified investigator. Sleep was no longer a consideration. His scientific mind, now fully awakened and overriding his instinct for self-preservation, had a new, singular purpose: to capture, triangulate, and analyze the source of the whisper. He was no longer a passive recorder of nature. He was an active hunter of the impossible. He spent the afternoon transforming his campsite into a sophisticated acoustic laboratory. He took his primary high-fidelity stereo recorder and placed it on his tripod in the exact same spot outside the tent. But that was just the bait. He then ran a thin, shielded cable from his secondary recorder into the tent, placing a small, omnidirectional microphone right in the center, just a few feet from where he planned to sit. Finally, he took a third, smaller, battery-powered recorder and placed it at the base of the gnarled Asian pine tree, the so-called listening tree from the article. His plan was simple but born of a desperate logic. By using 3 separate recording sources, his software could triangulate the precise origin of any sound in the clearing. There will be no more ambiguity. There will be nowhere for the whisper to hide. He was drawing a map, and he was daring the entity to place an X on it. As dusk fell, casting long, menacing shadows across the lake, Mark retreated into his tent and zipped it shut. He didn't prepare a meal. He didn't read. He sat cross-legged on his sleeping bag, a tangle of wires connecting his headphones to a live feed from all 3 microphone arrays. He had turned himself into the nerve center of his own horrifying experiment, a lone scientist in a vast, silent laboratory, waiting for his specimen to emerge. The forest outside was unnaturally quiet, as if it, too, was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen when a man tried to put a ghost under a microscope. The hours passed in an agony of anticipation. Mark sat motionless in the center of his tent, a sentinel in the web of wires, every nerve ending alive with a mixture of terror and scientific focus. The forest outside remained a black, silent void. Midnight came and went. 1 a.m., 2 a.m. There was nothing. The profound, dead silence was absolute, and a new kind of fear began to creep into Mark's mind. The fear that the entity was gone, that his one chance to capture and understand it had passed. He began to feel foolish. A man surrounded by expensive equipment, hunting a ghost that existed only in his own head. It was around 3 a.m. when he felt a sudden, sharp cramp in his leg from sitting still for so long. He shifted his weight. The rustle of his nylon pants, a loud, abrasive sound in the stillness. He coughed, a dry, quiet sound to clear his throat, and then he heard it. Through his headphones, from the microphone placed inside the tent with him, came a sound. It was a perfect, instantaneous mimicry of his own cough, but it was different. It was a dry, rustling, sibilant sound, like the crushing of dead leaves. It was the whisper, and it had just copied him. He froze, his blood turning to ice. It was here. It was inside the tent with him, in the darkness, and it was listening. His experiment was a success, and the results were more terrifying than he could have possibly imagined. He sat perfectly still, his breath held, listening. After a moment, the whisper came again, a rustling imitation of the sound of his shifting clothes. This was no longer a passive haunting. This was an interaction. The supernatural phenomena had escalated to a new, terrifying level of engagement. Mark's scientific mind, even in a state of absolute terror, took over. He had to test it. He had to get more data. With a trembling hand, he reached out and tapped a single finger against the top wall of the tent. Tap. From the headphones, he heard the reply. A dry, rustling sound that perfectly matched the rhythm of his own tap. Shh. He did it again. This time a more complex rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. The whisper replied instantly, its rustling voice a perfect echo of his rhythm. Shh, 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 shh. It was playing a game with him. A horrifying, childish game of copycat from across a dimensional veil. He was no longer just an observer. He was in a dialogue with the impossible. The entity was not just a mindless echo. It was intelligent, it was reactive, and it was mocking him. He was a scientist who had just made contact with an alien intelligence, but this intelligence was not from the stars. It was from the silence itself, and its only desire was to play. The game of copycat left Mark in a state of shattered, adrenaline-fueled terror. He spent the rest of the night huddled in his sleeping bag, every muscle tensed, listening to the profound, dead silence of the forest. The entity did not make another sound. It was as if, having proven its intelligence, it had now retreated, leaving Mark alone with the terrifying knowledge that he was sharing his small tent with an invisible, reactive, and mocking intelligence. He did not sleep. When the first gray light of dawn finally filtered through the nylon walls, it felt less like a sunrise and more like a brief reprieve, the end of a single battle in a war he knew he was losing. As he sat there in the cold morning light, his scientific mind, though battered by the impossible events of the night, began to work again. He was no longer just afraid. He was a man facing the single greatest and most terrifying puzzle of his life. He reviewed the data he had gathered. The entity was a mimic. It was intelligent. It was seemingly invisible and intangible. It had a voice, but that voice was a dry, rustling sound, like dead leaves. And it only seemed to appear, or at least interact, during moments of profound quiet. And that was when the new, terrifying question began to form in his mind. His entire investigation up to this point had been based on the sounds the entity made, the clicks, the whispers, the mimicked coughs. But what about the sounds it didn't make? What was happening in those long, unnatural gaps in his first recording? What was the entity doing when it was silent? His recorder's voice activation setting, a feature he had always trusted for its efficiency, now seemed like a critical flaw in his experiment. The device was designed to capture sound, but what if the true nature of the entity wasn't in the sound, but in the silence? The Vox setting had created blind spots, moments where the world went quiet and his digital ears simply closed. He realized with a jolt of horror that he had only been recording the creature's speech. He had never recorded its presence. A new, desperate plan formed. The final, terrifying investigation was about to begin. Tonight, he would not be trying to capture the whisper. He would be trying to capture the silence itself. He would change the recorder settings, turning off the voice activation, and forcing it into a continuous, uninterrupted recording mode. It would drain the battery twice as fast, but he had to know. He had to record the silence. He had to see what the absence of sound truly looked like on his screen. He had no idea that he was about to discover a truth far more monstrous than a simple whispering ghost. Mark spent his fourth and final night at the lake in a state of suspended terror, not sleeping, just waiting. He had set his primary recorder to continuous mode, a silent, digital witness that would capture every moment, every breath, every second of the profound quiet he had once revered. He didn't know what he expected to find. Maybe the whisper would be clear. Maybe he would capture the sound of its movement. The truth was something his rational mind could never have conceived. The next morning, his hands shaking so badly he could barely operate the controls, he sat down to listen to the unbroken, 8-hour recording. He didn't listen with his ears this time. He didn't trust them anymore. He watched. He opened the audio file in his spectrogram software, his eyes fixed on the visual representation of the soundscape, a long, green, undulating line representing the ambient noise of the forest. For hours, the line was exactly as it should be. A thick, complex band of low-frequency noise, the sound of the wind, the distant water, the very air itself vibrating. Then, he came to the time around 3 a.m., the time the entity had previously chosen to speak. He watched the screen, his heart pounding. He saw it before he heard it. On the screen, a change began to occur. A section of the thick, green band of ambient noise began to thin out, as if being eaten away from the inside. A perfect, clean, and utterly silent whole was being carved out of the natural soundscape. It wasn't that the world had gone quiet. It was that a piece of the world's sound was being actively, surgically erased. The whole grew larger, and then, from within that void of perfect digital zero, a new waveform appeared. It was the jagged, rustling shape of the whisper. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the screen and the final, terrible truth of the land, the nature of the entity, crashed down upon him, shattering his sanity. His hypothesis had been wrong. The whisper was not a sound that occurred in the silence. The silence itself was a creature, and the whisper was the sound it made when it moved, when it spoke. It was a predator made of absence, a being of pure, sound-devouring void. It didn't make a sound in the conventional sense. It spoke by erasing the sound around it, carving its voice out of the very fabric of the acoustic world. It was a whole in reality that had learned to speak his name. He finally understood the clicks, the gaps, the whispers. The entity was not a ghost that haunted the silence. It was the silence, and he had spent his entire life searching for it. Mark sat paralyzed in the suffocating darkness of the tent, a prisoner in his own mind. The silent, one-sided conversation continued. Every frantic thought that raced through his brain was met with a calm, dry, rustling echo in his headphones. "What are you?" he thought, his mind screaming the question. The whisper replied, the sound a dead leaf skittering across concrete. "R, what do you want from me?" "Want you." It was a broken, fragmented conversation. The entity's telepathic ability seemingly as ancient and imperfect as its voice. It was like talking to a sleepwalker or a deep-sea creature that had never known the light. But then, the entity seemed to gather its strength, focusing its intent. The rustling whispers in his ears stopped their fragmented replies and coalesced into a single, clear, and horrifying demand. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a roar. It was simple, calm, and final invitation. The entity's demand was not for justice, but for consumption. "Be quiet," the voice whispered, the sound now seeming to come from all three microphones at once. "Stay here." And then the final, terrible words, "with us." The meaning of the demand settled into Mark's soul with a cold, crushing weight. It didn't want to kill him. It wanted to assimilate him. It wanted him to stop fighting, to stop thinking, to stop being a source of noise and to simply become a part of its silent, eternal collection. The us in its demand was a horrifying revelation, implying that he was not the first, that the whispers of the forest he had read about were real. The lost hikers, the vanished animals, Dr. Finch, they were all here, quiet and waiting. In that moment, Mark's terror transformed. The scientist who had been fascinated by the anomaly, the victim who had been paralyzed by fear, were both gone. In their place was a cornered animal, a man filled with a primal, desperate need to survive. He was no longer just an observer of the silence. He was its intended prey, and he would not be taken quietly. Mark sat on the cold floor of the tent, the entity's final, terrible demand echoing not in his ears, but in the silent spaces of his mind. Be quiet, stay here, with us. The demand was a death sentence delivered as a lullaby. It offered not a violent end, but an eternal, silent assimilation. In that moment, something inside Mark shifted. The terror that had kept him paralyzed, the scientific curiosity that had driven him to foolishly engage with the entity, both were burned away by a new, white-hot emotion, the primal, defiant rage of a cornered animal. He would not be collected. He would not become another silent whisper in this thing's ghastly collection. His mind, sharpened by a surge of adrenaline, raced through the data he had collected, no longer as a victim, but as a biologist studying a predator on the verge of its kill. He analyzed its behavior, its methods, its environment. Fact 1. The entity's primary weapon is sound. It uses complex mimicked audio to lure, to terrorize, and to psychologically break its prey. Fact 2. It requires a specific environment to hunt effectively. It has silenced the entire forest. It needs to control the acoustic landscape to be the only thing making a sound, to create the very canvas on which it paints its horrors. Fact 3. It is intelligent. It learns, it adapts, it composes. It is not a mindless beast. And as he processed these facts, a desperate, insane, and beautifully logical idea began to form in his mind. This was the beginning of the confrontation, his desperate, primal struggle to survive. If a creature's entire existence, its entire method of hunting, is based on the precise control of sound, then its greatest weakness must be the loss of that control. If its power comes from creating a perfect, predatory silence, then the only way to fight it is to destroy that silence. He couldn't fight the whisper itself, but he could destroy the environment it needed to exist. He couldn't fight the silence, but he could fill it with so much noise, so much chaos, that the entity will be deafened, blinded, and unable to hunt. What if he could fight sound with sound? A wild, terrifying hope surged through him. He looked over at the corner of the tent where his scientific equipment sat, silent and waiting. The tools he had brought to this place to observe and record were about to become his only weapons. He was no longer the prey. He was about to start a war. The agonizing, multi-layered shriek of the entity faded into the distance, swallowed by the roaring wall of static that filled our small cabin. We stood there for a moment, hearts pounding, ears ringing, enveloped in the chaotic noise of our own making. I didn't know if the creature was gone for good, or if it was just stunned, hurt, regrouping in the darkness. And I wasn't going to wait to find out. Now, I yelled to Chloe over the deafening roar, grabbing her hand. We have to go now. There was no time to pack. I looked at my expensive recording equipment, my laptop containing years of research, my entire professional life laid out on that small wooden table, and I let it go. It was just dead weight now. I grabbed our car keys from the hook by the door and pulled Chloe with me. I hit the spacebar on the laptop, and the roaring static cut off instantly. The sudden, profound silence that rushed in was a shock to the system, almost as violent as the noise it replaced. It was the enemy's silence, a dead, empty, quiet, that felt heavy with menace. We scrambled to move the heavy sofa from the back window and pull the table away from the door. Every scrape of the furniture on the wooden floor sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. My hands fumbled with the old iron latch. With a final, groaning creak, the door swung open, revealing the cold, dark, and utterly silent forest outside. We burst out of the cabin and didn't look back. We ran, we plunged into the darkness, guided only by the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. The forest that had once been a place of wonder and then of terror was now just an obstacle, a maze of black trees we had to navigate to survive. This was the beginning of our escape, a desperate flight fueled by the hope that our gambit had bought us enough time. Every rustle of leaves behind us sounded like footsteps. Every shadow looked like a predator. The entity's song was gone, but the feeling of being haunted was more intense than ever. He ran until his lungs felt like they were on fire. The roaring of the inferno and the unholy scream of his burning copy chasing him through the night. Branches whipped at his face, and the heat at his back was intense. But he didn't stop. He didn't dare look back. He just ran until the woods gave way to asphalt, and he collapsed onto the cold, hard surface of the empty access road where he had parked his car. He lay there for a long time, gasping for air, his body trembling uncontrollably as he watched the orange glow of the fire consume the sky above the trees. He had escaped, but he was burned and severely traumatized. His jacket was singed, and a sharp pain radiated from his hand where he had held the burning list for too long. But those were just physical wounds. The real damage was deeper. He had survived, but he had paid a price. Eventually, he staggered back to his car, the adrenaline leaving him weak and hollow. He fumbled with the keys and collapsed into the driver's seat. Before starting the engine, he glanced up at the rearview mirror, and his breath caught in his throat. He saw his own face, streaked with soot and wild with terror. But it was his eyes that held him captive. They looked different, deeper inside the familiar color of his own iris. There was a small, dark part that was no longer his own. It was a fleck of pure black, a tiny, lightless void that wasn't there before. It was like a splinter of the shadow from the clearing had embedded itself not in his skin, but in his soul. He had looked into the abyss, and a piece of it had looked back and decided to stay. That was the real cost of survival. He had escaped the woods, but he had not escaped whole. Months later, Mark was a man living in a self-imposed prison of noise. He had fled the mountain, but the silence of that place, the hungry, listening void, had followed him. It clung to him like a shadow, a permanent scar on his psyche. He had abandoned his life's work, his expensive recording equipment, his passion, his entire identity as a soundscape artist. He left it all behind in that small tent by the silent lake. He couldn't bear it anymore. The tools he had once used to capture beauty now only served as a reminder of the horror he had recorded. He took a mundane, soul-crushing data entry job in the heart of the city, a place of constant, chaotic, and wonderfully meaningless noise. He surrounded himself with the roar of traffic, the wail of sirens, the incessant hum of 1,000 air conditioners. Noise was his new sanctuary. Silence was his new monster. His small apartment was never quiet. The television was always on, even when he wasn't watching it. Its cheerful, idiotic chatter a constant barrier against the silence. When he slept, he did so with a fan roaring in the corner and the podcast playing on low, a desperate wall of sound to keep the whispers of the night at bay. He had become a man who was terrified of the very thing he had once dedicated his life to pursuing. On the surface, he was functional. He went to work, he paid his bills, he spoke to no one about what had happened. How could he? How could he explain that he had been haunted by a sound? That he had a conversation with a void? He was a man with a ghost story that had no ghost, only a recording that he had deleted in a fit of pure terror the day he returned. But the piece he had built for himself was a fragile, desperate performance. Sometimes, in the dead of night, during a brief lull in the city's endless symphony. He would wake up, his heart pounding, his ears straining. And in that fleeting moment of quiet, he would feel it, the same cold, listening presence he had felt in the tent, the feeling that the silence in the room was not empty, that it was watching him, waiting. The haunting had followed him from the mountain, and it was patiently waiting for the noise to stop. He had almost allowed himself to believe that his fortress of noise was impenetrable, that the constant, chaotic symphony of the city could keep the memory of the mountain's terrible, listening silence at bay. He was wrong. The end of his fragile peace came on a Tuesday night in late November. A powerful storm had swept through the city, and Mark was secretly grateful for it. The sound of the wind howling between the tall buildings and the relentless drumming of rain against his window pane was a comforting, powerful noise. It was a sound that reminded him he was alive, that he was surrounded by a world that was loud and chaotic and real. He was sitting on his sofa, the blue light of the television washing over him, when the entire world went black. It happened in an instant. The television died with a soft pop. The roaring fan in the corner spun down into silence. The low, constant hum of the refrigerator vanished. Outside, the city, which had been a cacophony of sirens and traffic just a moment before, was plunged into an absolute, profound silence. A citywide power outage. And in that sudden, deafening quiet, Mark was no longer in his apartment. He was back on the mountain. The silence was the same. The heavy, listening, predatory silence. He sat frozen on his sofa, his heart hammering against his ribs. Every muscle in his body screaming at him to make a sound, to do anything to break the stillness. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking, but the screen was dead, the battery drained. He was trapped in the one thing he had, spent months running from. And then he heard it. It wasn't a sound from the street below. It wasn't a sound from the apartment next door. It was a sound that materialized out of the perfect, suffocating silence right next to his ear. It was a dry, rustling, sibilant whisper, a sound like dead leaves skittering across cold pavement. It was a voice he had prayed he would never hear again, and it whispered a single, familiar, and final word. Mark. The haunting had followed him. He had escaped the forest, but he had never escaped the silence. The entity was not a feature of the mountain. It was a feature of the quiet itself. And now, in the heart of the city, in the darkness of his own home, the silence had come to claim him. And so, the story of Mark, the man who hunted silence, ends not with a scream, but with a whisper. No one ever saw him again. When he didn't check in at the end of his scheduled trip, a search party was sent. They found his jeep at the trailhead. They found his campsite by the lake, the tent still standing, his expensive equipment laid out on the table, untouched. But of Mark himself, there was no trace. He had vanished as completely as the sound he had tried to capture. The official report would state he was likely the victim of a predator, or perhaps he had simply walked away, another soul lost to the vast, indifferent wilderness. But we, who have heard his story, know the truth. He was not taken by a bear or a mountain lion. He did not fall into a ravine. Mark was not lost. He was found. He was a man who spent his life chasing the void. And in the end, the void reached out and embraced him. He has become a part of the collection, another silent whisper in the creature's terrible, growing symphony. So this is the final warning, the last lesson learned from Mark's final recording. Be careful of the quiet places. Be wary of the silence that feels too perfect, too absolute. The world is full of sounds, a constant, beautiful, chaotic song of life. And if you ever find yourself in a place where that song has completely died away, you are not alone. You are in its hunting ground. Don't listen for what's in the silence. Listen for what isn't. What do you think is the most terrifying sound to hear when you know you're completely alone? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of the creature of silence left you with a chill, please leave a like to support the channel. It lets the darkness know you were listening. And if you wish to hear more tales from the quiet, forgotten corners of the world, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell for notifications. You never know what might be listening for you next.